The word hanging from Eliza Hale's neck weighed less than a pound, but by noon it had bent the whole town toward cruelty. It was written in black paint on a rough board, one word large enough for every passing wagon to see: thief. She stood on the courthouse steps in Dust Creek with her hands folded before her. A blue shawl slipped low on one shoulder, and the wind lifting dust around her boots. No one had proven anything. No one had asked her to speak. They had only gathered close enough to stare and far enough to feel safe. The dry goods owner, Silas Vane, stood beside Sheriff Amos Reed with his polished coat buttoned tight and his chin raised like a preacher before a sermon. Winter stores went missing, Silas told the crowd. Flour, medicine, cloth. And this woman was seen near the relief shed after dark. The crowd murmured because murmuring was easier than thinking. Eliza kept her eyes on the street, where wagon wheels had carved old lines into the dirt. Her face showed no anger. That seemed to trouble them more than tears would have. Some folks wanted a confession because a confession would make their shame feel cleaner. Others wanted her to lower her head because dignity in the wrong person always made small men uncomfortable. Sheriff Reed unfolded a paper and cleared his throat, but his voice would not rise properly. He knew the charge was thin. Everyone near him could hear it. Still, fear can make a badge feel lighter than a feather. Silas stepped closer to Eliza and reached toward the blue shawl, as if to display it for the crowd. Before his fingers touched the cloth, hoofbeats rolled in from the west end of town. Slow, measured, not hurried, not afraid. Heads turned. A dark bay horse came through the dust, carrying a cowboy in a sun-faded hat and a trail coat marked by long miles. Caleb Whitmore did not look like a man hunting trouble. He looked like a man who had already found it and was deciding whether it deserved words. He stopped in front of the courthouse, swung down from the saddle, and let the reins fall over the hitching rail. His eyes moved from the sheriff's paper to Silas Vane's clean gloves, then to the board around Eliza's neck. For a long second, he said nothing. The silence changed shape. It stopped belonging to the crowd. Caleb stepped onto the first courthouse step. Who put that word on her? Silas gave a short smile. The town did. Caleb looked across the faces watching from the street, the porch fronts, the store windows, and the wagon beds. Towns do not write, he said. Men do. The smile left Silas slowly. Sheriff Reed folded the paper once, then stopped, as if even the sound of creasing it had become too loud. Eliza finally looked at Caleb. Her eyes were tired, guarded, and steady in a way the crowd had not earned. At her feet, half buried in dust, lay the corner of her blue shawl where it had dragged against the steps. Caleb bent, lifted it carefully, and saw 3 tiny letters stitched near the hem: C, B, H. The thread was pale blue, nearly hidden unless a person knew how to look. He held the shawl out to her, not over her, not like charity, but like returning something that had always been hers. Then he turned back to the sheriff. Read the charge again, Caleb said. But this time, read the evidence first. The sheriff's eyes moved across the paper as if the words had grown thorns since the last time he held it. Caleb stood one step below him, close enough to hear the dry scrape in the man's throat, far enough to give him room to choose what kind of lawman he wanted to be before sundown. Dust Creek watched with its mouth half open. Eliza stood behind the board on her neck, the blue shawl now folded over her arm, and for the first time that morning the town was not looking only at her. It was looking at the men who had placed her there. Sheriff Reed cleared his throat. The charge states that flour, medicine, and cloth were taken from the winter relief shed between sundown and dawn. Caleb waited. The sheriff looked up, then down again. Witness statement provided by Mr. Silas Vane. A low rustle moved through the crowd. Caleb turned his eyes to Silas. One witness. Silas lifted his chin. One honest witness is enough when a town is hungry. Hungry towns need truth more than they need certainty, Caleb said. It was not loud. That made it worse for Silas. Loud words could be challenged. Quiet ones had a way of settling into cracks. Eliza looked at Caleb then, not with trust yet, but with attention. She had lived for 6 months in a sod-walled cabin 2 miles beyond the creek bed, where the cottonwoods thinned and the ground turned sandy. Folks came to her when their children coughed through cold nights, when their hands split from winter work, when threadbare sleeves needed mending and pride kept them from asking in daylight. They traded quietly. A cup of cornmeal, a heel of bread, a spool of thread. Never much. Never enough to make her belong. Caleb knew what that edge of town felt like. He had ridden edges all his life. He was Caleb Whitmore, son of a freighter who once trusted a crowd and never came home with his name clean. Since then, Caleb had learned to distrust easy anger, especially when it came dressed as righteousness. He believed in hoofprints, signatures, dates, locks, ledgers, and the look in a person's eyes when a lie stepped too close. Eliza's eyes did not carry the panic of someone caught. They carried the tired patience of someone already judged before she woke that morning. Caleb pointed to the relief shed beside the courthouse, its padlock hanging on a hasp bright from use. Who keeps the key? Sheriff Reed shifted his weight. Mr. Vane holds one. I hold the other. Who checked the shed last night? Mr. Vane. Who reported the loss? Mr. Vane. Caleb let the answers sit there, plain as tin cups on a table. Silas gave a smooth laugh. Are you suggesting I stole from my own town? Caleb looked at the board around Eliza's neck. I am suggesting this town should stop hanging words on people before it counts its keys. A woman near the well lowered her eyes. A man by the feed store scratched his jaw and found nothing useful to say. Then a small boy stepped from behind a wagon wheel, staring not at the board, not at Caleb, but at the blue shawl in Eliza's hands. That's stitching, he whispered. His mother pulled him back, but the boy kept looking. My sister had a fever. That is her cloth. The street went still again, but this stillness had a different weight. Eliza's fingers tightened around the shawl. Caleb saw it. Silas saw it too, and for the first time his polished confidence showed a hairline crack. The boy's words drifted across the street softer than dust, but they reached every porch. His mother pressed a hand to his shoulder, not to silence him from shame, but from fear of what truth might cost a family with little to spare. Caleb turned toward the child slowly. What is your name? The boy swallowed. Thomas Bell. At the name, Eliza's eyes moved to him, and something in her guarded face loosened by a thread. Caleb held out the blue shawl, careful not to wave it like proof, careful not to turn it into another public display. You know this cloth? Thomas nodded. My little sister wore it when she was sick. Miss Eliza wrapped it around her by the creek house. Ma said the cold had gotten into her chest and would not leave. Mrs. Bell tried to pull him back then, but the crowd had already shifted toward her, and hiding became harder than speaking. She was a thin woman with tired eyes and a bonnet faded from too many washings. She looked at Eliza, then at the board still hanging from her neck, and the shame on her face was not the kind that belonged to guilt. It belonged to gratitude kept quiet too long. She helped my Clara, Mrs. Bell said at last. Brought herbs, warmed cloth by the stove, sat half the night while the rest of us were afraid the child would not wake easy. No one spoke. Even the loose sign on the mercantile seemed to stop creaking for a breath. Silas Vane recovered first. Men like him always kept a second smile ready. A pretty story, he said. But kindness once does not clear theft today. Caleb looked at him. No, but it tells us the shawl was not stolen from the relief shed. Silas waved a gloved hand. Cloth travels. A thief can use any scrap to dress herself decent. Eliza's fingers tightened around the shawl, but her voice, when it came, stayed level. The letters are Clara Bell Harper, she said. Her mother asked me to stitch them so the child would know it was hers. Mrs. Bell nodded, eyes shining but steady. I paid her with 2 eggs and a spool of pale blue thread. Caleb turned back to the sheriff. Was pale blue thread listed among the missing goods? Sheriff Reed looked at the paper again. He knew the answer before he found it. No. Was a blue shawl listed? No. Silas's jaw worked once. The crowd felt it then, that first small turn in the road, when a story told too easily begins to lose its wheels. Caleb stepped closer to the relief shed and examined the padlock without touching it. The hasp was bright, yes, but the dust at the threshold told another matter. Wagon tracks crossed in front of it, deep on the right side, light on the left, as if the load had been heavier leaving than coming in. Caleb crouched, brushed the dirt with 2 fingers, and looked toward Silas's storehouse across the street. Same wheel width, same iron rim scar. Sheriff, he said, when did the relief wagon last unload? 3 days ago. And when was the loss found? This morning. Caleb stood. Then why do these tracks run from the shed toward Mr. Vane's back lot, fresh from last night's frost? The crowd turned as one body toward the mercantile. Silas laughed again, but this time it had no polish left. Every wagon in town leaves tracks. Caleb looked at the board around Eliza's neck, then at the street full of people who had believed a word before they checked the dirt beneath it. That is true, he said. So let us follow this one. The track led them slowly, and that made it worse for Silas Vane. Fast truth can be dismissed as excitement, but slow truth makes a town walk beside it and watch every step. Caleb moved from the courthouse yard toward the mercantile back lot with Sheriff Reed at his shoulder, Eliza a few paces behind, and half of Dust Creek following in a line that had lost its appetite for shouting. The board still hung from Eliza's neck, knocking softly against her dress with each step. That sound, wood against cloth, followed Caleb like a small accusation against everyone who had allowed it to remain. The wagon marks crossed behind the feed trough, past the rain barrel, and cut deep near the rear gate of Silas's storehouse, where the ground stayed soft from shade. Caleb knelt and touched the rim mark in the mud. One wheel had a notch in its iron band, leaving a small crescent every turn. He looked at the wagon parked beneath Silas's awning. Same crescent, same distance between wheels, same dried clay packed under the left rim. Silas folded his arms. My wagon goes many places. That proves nothing. Caleb nodded once. Then you will not mind opening the storehouse. The crowd became still enough to hear a horse blow through its nose near the hitching rail. Sheriff Reed looked at Silas. Open it. For the first time that day, Silas did not move quickly. He reached for his key ring and sorted through it too long, metal clicking against metal in the cold air. Eliza watched his hands. So did Caleb. A man can tell a lie with his mouth, but his fingers often tell on him. When Silas finally unlocked the back door, the smell of burlap, oil, and stored grain rolled out. The room was dim, stacked with crates, barrels, bolts of cloth, lantern wicks, sacks of flour, and coffee tins. Nothing looked wrong to a person who only glanced. Caleb did not glance. He stepped inside and let his eyes adjust. On the floor near the far wall, white dust had spilled from one sack and been swept poorly toward a corner. A strip of brown paper lay beneath a crate, stamped with the county relief seal. Caleb picked it up and handed it to Sheriff Reed. Does your private stock usually come stamped by the county? Sheriff Reed read the seal and said nothing. Silence, from a lawman, can be louder than a verdict. Mrs. Bell came to the doorway, holding Thomas close. Her eyes moved to a shelf where small medicine bottles sat wrapped in paper. That label, she whispered. That is the same fever tonic they told us was gone. Silas turned sharply. Those are mine. Bought through proper channels. Caleb walked to the shelf and lifted one bottle without opening it. Then there should be a receipt. Silas's face hardened. I do not answer to drifters. Caleb set the bottle down with care. No, you answer to records. He looked at Sheriff Reed. Where is the relief ledger? The sheriff hesitated. Then his hand moved to his coat pocket, and his face told the town he had known enough to be afraid and not enough to be brave. At my office, he said. Caleb turned toward Eliza. She had not stepped inside the storehouse. She stood in the doorway with sunlight behind her and the ugly board still on her chest. Caleb looked at it, then at the sheriff. Before we read another line, he said, take that off her. Sheriff Reed looked at the board as if seeing it for the first time, not as a piece of wood, but as a choice he had allowed other men to make for him. The word across it had dried crooked, black paint sunk deep into grain, rough at the edges where the brush had dragged too fast. Eliza stood still while he reached for the cord. She did not help him. She did not lower her head to make it easier. That was not pride. That was the last small ground she had left, and she held it without asking anyone to admire her for it. The sheriff's fingers fumbled once at the knot, then found it. The cord loosened. The board dropped into his hands. Its absence changed the air around her. Nothing else moved. Yet suddenly the doorway looked wider, the sky brighter behind her shoulder, the town a little smaller in its shame. Caleb picked up the blue shawl from where she had folded it over her arm and offered it back. Eliza took it, wrapped it around herself, and the pale blue letters at the hem disappeared beneath her hand. Silas watched the gesture with a face gone pale around the mouth. Sentiment will not balance a ledger, he said. Caleb turned toward him. That is the first honest thing you have said. They walked back to the sheriff's office with the crowd following at a distance now, not eager, not loud, but drawn by the slow pull of a truth they could no longer pretend not to see. The office smelled of paper, cold coffee, boot dust, and old tobacco. Sheriff Reed unlocked the desk drawer and removed the relief ledger, a brown book with bent corners and a cracked spine. He set it on the table between Caleb and Silas. Eliza remained near the door. Mrs. Bell stood beside her, close enough to be counted with her, not in front of her, not speaking for her, simply there. That, too, was a kind of apology. Caleb opened the ledger. Dates lined the pages in careful columns. Flour, medicine, cloth, beans, kerosene, delivery received, distribution pending, signature of custodian. Silas Vane's name appeared again and again, neat as fence wire. Caleb ran one finger down the entries and stopped at the week of the first hard frost. 20 sacks of flour received, he read. 10 listed as distributed. Mrs. Bell spoke softly. My family was told there was none left. A man from the back of the room muttered that he had been told the same. Then another. Then a woman by the window. The murmurs rose, not like anger this time, but like people counting backward through their own hunger and realizing where the numbers had been made to disappear. Caleb turned a page. Medicine received. 6 crates. Distributed to clinic, 1 crate. Sheriff Reed leaned closer, his brow tightening. There is no clinic in Dust Creek. Silas reached for the ledger, but Caleb closed one hand over the page before the merchant touched it. No force, just finality. Where did the other 5 go? Caleb asked. Silas looked toward the window, toward the street, toward anywhere that did not ask him to answer. Then Eliza stepped forward. The room quieted because she had not moved unless she meant to. From beneath her shawl, she took a small folded receipt, worn soft from being carried. Mr. Vane sold medicine to a freight driver 2 nights ago, she said. I was outside with Mrs. Bell's child. I heard the price. She placed the receipt on the ledger. The driver dropped this near the rain barrel. Caleb unfolded it. Sheriff Reed read the merchant's mark at the bottom. Silas's mark. Dust Creek finally understood that the woman they had shamed for stealing medicine had been the only one who tried to return the proof. Silas Vane looked at the receipt as if paper had become a living thing with teeth. For a moment, nobody in the sheriff's office moved. The stove clicked. The wind rubbed dust against the window glass. Outside, the town waited in the street, pressing close to the door and the open windows, quiet enough now to hear its own mistake breathing. Sheriff Reed took the receipt from Caleb and held it beside the ledger. The merchant's mark matched. The date matched. The amount paid was written plain, 3 times higher than county price, with the words winter tonic and cloth bundle underlined in a careful hand. Caleb looked from the receipt to Silas. You sold what was meant to be given. Silas straightened, reaching for the last coat a guilty man owns, indignation. I kept those goods safe from waste. People take when things are free. They beg. They exaggerate. I made sure supplies went where they had value. Mrs. Bell gave a small sound, not loud, but sharp with hurt. Thomas stood beside her, staring at the floor. Eliza looked at the boy, then at the ledger, and her face did not harden. That was the part Caleb noticed. She had every right to anger, yet she held herself like someone carrying water through a crowd, careful not to spill what mattered. Silas saw the room turning and tried to turn it back. He pointed at Caleb. And you all would trust a trail rider over a businessman who has served this town for 12 years. Caleb did not answer quickly. He walked to the window and looked out at Dust Creek. The feed store, the church bell, the wagons, the women with shawls drawn tight, the men who had shouted an hour ago and now studied their boots like the ground might forgive them. 12 years is long enough to learn where people keep their hunger, Caleb said. Long enough to profit from it, too. Silas's eyes flashed toward Sheriff Reed. Do your duty. The sheriff closed the ledger, but his hand stayed on it. Something in his shoulders changed. Not courage fully grown, not yet, but the first straightening of a man tired of bending. I should have checked the shed before I let them put that board on her, he said. His voice cracked on the last word, and the crack made it more honest. He looked at Eliza. I was wrong. Eliza held his gaze. She did not rescue him from the discomfort of saying it. She let the apology stand in the room by itself, plain and unfinished. Caleb picked up the ugly board from where it leaned against the desk. He turned it over. On the back, the black paint had bled through in thin veins. He set it face down on the table. A crowd is not evidence, he said. A ledger can be. A receipt can be. Tracks can be. A child's shawl can be. when men have forgotten how to tell the truth. Then Mrs. Bell reached into the pocket of her worn coat and brought out a small notebook tied with string. Her hands trembled, but her voice did not. "Mr. Vane asked me to sign for flour I never received," she said. "He said the county would stop sending help if the forms looked incomplete." She placed the notebook beside the ledger. I wrote down every date. One by one, others in the doorway began to speak. Not loudly, not bravely at first. A missing sack, a delayed bottle, a fee charged for donated cloth. Small truths, each one no heavier than a stitch, until together they made a seam Silas could not tear. By late afternoon, the sheriff's office could no longer hold the truth, so the truth moved back into the street. Sheriff Reed carried the ledger under one arm, Mrs. Bell carried her notebook with both hands, and Caleb walked beside Eliza without stepping ahead of her. That mattered. Dust Creek had spent the morning placing her where it wanted her, on courthouse steps, beneath a painted word, inside a story written by other people. Now she walked at her own pace, blue shawl around her shoulders, eyes forward, while the town opened around her like a gate it had forgotten how to use. Silas Vane followed with his jaw tight and his gloves clenched in one fist. He had not been bound. He had not been dragged. No one needed to make a show of him. The papers were enough, and paper can be a heavier chain than iron when every signature tells on the man who wrote it. On the courthouse steps, Sheriff Reed set the ledger on the same rail where Eliza had stood that morning. The ugly board lay beside it, face down. Caleb noticed that no one wanted to turn it over. The whole town knew what it said. The whole town knew who had worn it. The sheriff opened the ledger and read the dates, the missing sacks, the false distributions, the medicine sold outside town, and the cloth marked as donated but charged back to families who had already given all they could spare. With every line, Silas seemed to shrink without moving. When Sheriff Reed finished, Mrs. Bell stepped forward and read from her notebook. Her voice was not grand. It was not trained for public speaking. It was a mother's voice, tired from winter, worn from worry, and steady because it had finally stopped hiding. She read the days she had been turned away, the names of neighbors who had paid for goods meant to help them, and the night Eliza came with warm cloth for Clarabelle Harper when no one else had any to spare. Then Thomas Bell walked up holding the blue shawl corner in both hands. "She stitched my sister's name," he said, "so Clara would know she still had something that belonged to her." That was when the crowd changed for good. Not loudly. There was no cheer, no sudden forgiveness, no easy washing clean. Just eyes lowering, hats coming off, hands folding, people standing in the weight of what they had nearly helped become. Silas tried one last time. "You are letting sentiment blind you," he said. She was near the shed after dark. Eliza turned then. The street quieted around her. "I was near the shed," she said, "because Mrs. Bell asked me to watch if medicine came in. Her child was cold. I waited there so no one would have to beg in daylight." No one answered. Caleb picked up the board, turned it over, and looked at the word. Then he handed it to Sheriff Reed. "This belongs in your office," he said. "Not as evidence against her. As evidence against all of you." The sheriff took it, and his face showed that he understood. The courthouse steps had seen many things in Dust Creek, but never a silence like the one that followed. It did not feel empty. It felt full of all the words folks should have said before a woman had been made to carry their fear around her neck. Sheriff Reed held the board in both hands, then turned it toward the crowd, so the painted word faced them instead of Eliza. No one looked at it for long. Silas Vane stood near the hitching rail with his gloves crushed in his fist, his fine coat suddenly looking too small for him. "This is theater," he said, though his voice had lost the clean edge it wore that morning. "Receipts can be misunderstood. Ledgers can be corrected." Caleb looked at the relief shed, then at the mercantile, then at the wagon with the crescent notch in its wheel. "Then correct it before the judge," he said. Sheriff Reed nodded slowly, and that nod was not much, but it was the first honest piece of authority the town had seen all day. He asked 2 deputies from the feed store to stand witness while he sealed the ledger, the receipt, and Mrs. Bell's notebook in a canvas pouch. Nobody rushed. Nobody shouted. Justice, when it finally started walking, moved at the pace of paperwork, witness names, and a man's signature placed where excuses could not reach it. Then Eliza stepped down from the courthouse steps and crossed the street toward the mercantile. The crowd parted without being asked. Caleb followed several paces behind, close enough if she needed him, far enough to let every eye see that she was not being led. At the storehouse door, she stopped beside a stack of cloth bolts and pointed to the lower shelf. "There," she said. Sheriff Reed lifted a folded tarp and found 3 sacks of flour beneath it, each stamped with the county seal. Behind those sat a crate of medicine bottles wrapped in brown paper. Beside them were bundles of wool cloth tied with blue twine. The missing goods had not vanished. They had only been hidden behind a man who knew how to sound respectable. Mrs. Bell covered her mouth with one hand. Thomas stared at the crate as if it were a lamp lit in a dark room. Silas looked at Eliza then, not with apology, but with the startled anger of someone who had mistaken quiet for weakness. Eliza did not give him anger back. She picked up one bundle of wool and carried it outside. "This goes to the Harper child," she said. Then she lifted a sack of flour with both hands, and Caleb reached for it only after she nodded. One by one, the townspeople began taking what had been meant for them, not grabbing, not celebrating, but receiving with the careful shame of people handed back something they should never have lost. Sheriff Reed wrote each name down. Caleb checked each mark. Eliza stood beside the wagon and matched cloth to families who had come to her in the dark, remembering what each child needed, which old man had thin sleeves, which widow had no lining left in her coat. That was the truth Silas had feared most. She had not been stealing from the town. She had been remembering it when the town forgot her. By sundown, the relief shed was open, the storehouse was marked for county inspection, and Silas Vane was told to remain in Dust Creek until the circuit judge arrived. No rope, no spectacle, just law, at last, putting its boots on straight. When the last sack was recorded, Caleb found the ugly board leaning against the sheriff's desk. Eliza took it from him, turned it over, and handed it to Thomas Bell. "Paint the other side," she said gently. "Write your sister's name on it. Make something useful." Thomas nodded, holding it like a task, not a burden. And Dust Creek watched the woman it had shamed give even that piece of wood a chance to become something better. The next morning came pale and cold, but Dust Creek did not wake the same way it had the day before. The courthouse steps were empty. The relief shed stood open with a clean ledger on a barrel beside the door, and Sheriff Reed sat there in his coat, writing down every sack, every bottle, every yard of cloth that left for a family in need. No one laughed near those steps anymore. No one stood there just to watch another person carry shame. By noon, Thomas Bell returned with the board tucked beneath one arm. The black word had been sanded down until only a shadow of it remained in the grain, and on the other side, painted in careful white letters, was the name Clara Bell Harper. Around the letters, he had drawn small blue flowers like the ones stitched on his sister's shawl. Eliza saw it from across the street and stopped walking. For a long breath, the town seemed to wait on her face. She did not smile at first. She only placed one hand over the pale blue hem of the shawl and looked at the boy as if he had done something braver than he understood. "That will suit her," she said. Thomas stood a little taller. Mrs. Bell cried quietly, but not from sorrow this time. Caleb watched from beside his horse, one hand resting on the saddle horn, the other holding his hat against the wind. He had seen towns turn cruel before. He had seen men hide behind crowds and call it law. But he had rarely seen a town stand still long enough to feel the weight of what it had done. One by one, people came to Eliza, not in a rush, not with grand speeches, but with small offerings that sounded almost like confession. A woman brought a spool of thread she had promised months ago. A store clerk brought back the basket Eliza had left near the courthouse. An old ranch hand tipped his hat and said he should have spoken sooner. Eliza accepted none of it like payment. She accepted it like weather changing. Quietly, carefully, without trusting the sun too fast. When the circuit judge arrived 2 days later, the papers were ready, the witnesses were ready, and Silas Vane's fine explanations could not find a place to stand. The goods were restored. The false charges were struck from the town record. Sheriff Reed wrote Eliza Hale's name cleanly in the book and set the pen down as if closing a door that should never have been opened. That evening, Caleb walked with Eliza to the edge of Dust Creek, where her small cabin sat beyond the creek bed under a sky turning gold. The town lights flickered behind them. Ahead, cottonwoods moved softly in the wind. "You could leave," Caleb said. Eliza looked back at the town for a long moment. "I could," she answered. Then she touched the shawl at her shoulders. "But some children still need warm cloth before winter." Caleb nodded. because some answers did not need improving. Behind them, the courthouse bell rang once for evening, low and plain across the dust. Eliza kept walking, not hurried, not hidden, not carrying anyone else's word around her neck. And Dust Creek learned that day what it should have known before sunrise. Truth does not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it rides in quiet, asks one honest question, and lets shame